Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Way the World Works, a Tuttle Twins podcast. So September, August, this time of year, it's back to school time for a lot of you. I know some of you are homeschool, unschool, all sorts of different kinds of schooling, but for most of the country, it is now time to go back to school, which is weird to me because I remember, and I'm dating myself here, I'm going to go back in the day. I remember when I went to school in California, we did not start school until like 2 or 3 weeks after Labor Day. I feel like we are starting earlier and earlier every year, but that seems to be the trend. So I don't know if they're shortening summers or you guys are getting out at different times, but I don't know. Seems like we're not getting long enough summers. That's what I think anyway. So today I want to talk a little bit about schooling and education. And those two words might sound like they're the same, but are they? That's kind of what I want to talk about. I want us to be thinking about that question as we talk about one of my absolute heroes. He was such an inspiration to me as a teacher, and his name is John Taylor Gatto. He is just probably the best teacher I actually never got to have as a teacher, but the best teacher. In fact, he won Best Teacher of the Year award more than once in New York, which is an infamously hard, very difficult school district because you have a lot of kids. People might try to say they're underfunded, but as we know, the Department of Education is well-funded, overly funded. The problem is that the spending problems are out of control and not going to the right places, but I digress. So if you haven't picked up the Tuttle Twins Education Vacation, highly recommend it because it's all about John Taylor Gatto, which I really love. He's got fun illustrations in there. Unfortunately, he passed away about 7 years ago. And that was a big loss for those of us who really believed in education freedom. And but I want to honor him today as I think it's a perfect back to school year theme. So John Taylor Gatto, like I said, had won Teacher of the Award. He was brilliant. But he started realizing into his career as a teacher that it wasn't what he thought it was supposed to be. And maybe the school system in general was built to fail, if you will. So one thing that really got him is he was noticing that he was spending most of his time teaching kids, and I think they were junior high school age for him, teaching them or keeping them in line, keeping, behavioral management. And he didn't like that. He didn't like that he was not getting to foster education. He was having to be a warden, like wardens that work at prisons. Like he was having to lay down the law. And that's what he was spending most of his time doing. And that really rubbed him the wrong way because he didn't get into being an educator to be a policeman, right? And then you have to wonder, and this was something that struck me as a teacher. I taught third grade, and I loved what I did. I loved the school I taught at. It was a great private school. They do so many wonderful things, but I didn't like having to spend all my time doing behavioral management either. And one thing that struck me, that was one reason I stopped being a teacher, was that I didn't like that kids' playtime was interrupted. They didn't have time to use their imagination more than 30 minutes a day when they got to go to lunchtime and recess. And so they weren't getting to find out what they love, to foster those things that gave them joy and happiness. Instead, schools teach kids that there's this one-size-fits-all model, that kids are like conveyor belts. It's like the dolls you get. I don't know, what are these creepy Labubu dolls or whatever I'm seeing, or Barbies, whatever it is, when you see them come off a production line, they are exactly the same. And that's what schooling today, that's what modern schooling has been set up to do. It's been set up to teach kids to obey their teachers, to sit down and be good members of society, to obey the rules and just follow orders. And that's a lot of what schools, private, public, a lot of them teach. And so this production line model, this is what John Taylor Gatto was starting to see, and he didn't like that. Because one thing he noticed with his students is how they each had these they were individuals, first of all. They were real people, not just kids who didn't have opinions or thoughts or dreams. But he noticed that they each had special gifts, and he wasn't allowed to foster those special gifts because the way the school system was set up just didn't allow for that. We are taught to switch subjects as soon as a bell rings. And let's say, like for me, I loved writing. I'm still a writer today, but I didn't want to stop when the bell rang or when, the timer went off and we had to switch to a different subject. I wish I could have spent so much time just really honing in on my writing and learning how to be a better writer instead of having to do that later on. But instead we had to, get really into something and then, science time, switch. Math time, switch. And I'm not saying it's not important to learn math or science, but there's other ways to learn it. One thing that, the more unschooling or self-directed learning, which John Taylor Gatto was a big proponent of, one thing that teaches is that everything is a lesson. You can go out and garden and that's a science lesson. That's a nutrition lesson. You can go to the grocery store and, your parents, they can give you a budget and a certain, and you have to get certain items and fit within that budget. That's a math lesson right there. And these are things that make it interactive, that make it really fun. And we don't get to do that in the traditional schooling method, right? We sit at a desk for hours and hours and hours. We get to write for, 50 minutes, and then we switch to reading, and then we do this. And it turns us into robots, which we are not robots. As we all know, we all have hobbies and skills. So this was really festering in John Taylor Gatto's mind. And he was thinking, I can't do this anymore to my students. I don't want to be part of the problem. And he starts looking into it, and he realizes that all these things, turning students into production line, into obedient little human capital is a term you'll see used a lot, which is terrible. Human capital is basically good little workers, little worker bees that don't think for themselves. And he had won Teacher of the Year award this same year, and he had kind of hit his breaking point. And so he decides that after decades teaching, he's going to quit, and he did it in a very unique and very public way. So he wrote this resignation letter. I quit, I think, is what it was called. And he ended up submitting it to the Wall Street Journal, who published his big exit from the school system. And it was pretty scathing, as they say. He talked about how in good conscience, he could not continue on in this education model anymore. His duty, the reason he got into education, was to educate students, not school them, not put them in this production line, but to give them the freedom to love learning and to figure out what it is that drives them in life. What is their purpose? What is their bliss? What is it that makes them so excited? Maybe there's the kid that isn't the best at math, but he loves drawing and he wants to be a comic book, artist. Why aren't we fostering that? Why aren't we letting kids do what they like to do? Why are we teaching them that life is about, putting your head down and doing busy work? And I'm not saying there aren't unpleasant things in life. Believe me, there are. But why do we have to make our jobs, our passion, something that we don't really want to do? We want to follow our passion, rather, is what I should say. So I'm going to read some of his letter. So forgive me for looking at the screen. I try not to, but I want to make sure I get this right. So his letter says, I've come slowly to understand what it is I really teach. A curriculum of confusion, class position, arbitrary justice, vulgarity, rudeness, disrespect for privacy, indifference to quality, and utter dependency. I teach how to fit into a world I don't want to live in. I just can't do it anymore. I can't train children to wait to be told what to do. I can't train people to drop what they are doing when the bell sounds. I can't persuade children to feel some justice in their class placement when there isn't any. And I can't persuade children to believe teachers have valuable secrets they can acquire by becoming our disciples. That isn't true. So let's break this down a little bit, because I think there's so much greatness. I love where he says arbitrary justice. And this reminds me of something that really struck me as a student when I was a kid. I remember there was some kids talking during class, and my teacher punished the whole class and made us stay after school. It wasn't me who was talking. It usually was, but it wasn't this time. But it was other students, but our whole class was collectively punished. We were collectively treated the same instead of individuals. And that is something that sat with me before I even knew I was an individualist. I think that helped shape me as being an individualist, because I wasn't seen as an individual, and teachers often aren't trained to do that. So that's kind of, I love when he says arbitrary justice, is just as it doesn't make any sense. Disrespect for privacy. This is a big one. Students, there's a lot of times, and there have been some Supreme Court cases to say whether or not students have the same privileges or rights, as the Bill of Rights. But privacy is one of them. We know way too much about kids, and teachers pry and schools try to get more information. And it's like, what? You wouldn't do that to an adult. They try, but it's not fair for kids either. So, and then he says, my utter dependency, I like that. and that I teach how to fit into a world I don't want to live in. Why are we being molded like clay by other people to do production line stuff, to do what everyone thinks we should do instead of following our passions? And then I love the next part when he says, I can't persuade children to feel some justice in their class placement when there isn't any. And this gets to another thing that's at the heart of what John Taylor Gatto believed. And that is that this concept of grade levels and even grades themselves doesn't make a whole lot of sense because, okay, so maybe I am a little bit slower at learning how to read. But I find a book I really love, and by 11, I'm reading at college level, even though I was slow to start learning how to read at, 5, 6, 7. So people grow at different paces. I am going to learn something at a much different pace than any of you at home. So why are we being clumped by our ages? Why are we saying, oh, if you're 12, you have to know this, and if you don't, you're dumb and you have to be held back a year? It's training us that we all have to learn at the same pace, and that just isn't true. And I think it makes us hate learning a little bit, because if you can't get that math concept that's really hard to you, but you're seeing all the kids next to you get it, that can really, ruin your self-esteem and make you think, oh, I'm not good at this. Maybe I just hate math, when maybe it's just your brain works differently. Maybe you don't want to read out of a textbook. Maybe you want to, if you're learning numbers, play around with things and count them. If you want to, go to the grocery store, learn how to budget, learn how to do these different things that are just not sitting at a desk and looking at a book all day. And so there's all these problems with the school system, and he's laying this out. And this, launches him on this career where he starts really digging into the history of American education. And he comes to find out that it actually comes from this model called the Prussian model of education. And that's going to get started in America. So Prussia is now what is Germany. Back then it was kind of like, think of like military, where it was, again, production, like you have to learn this and you have to obey. And then this guy named John Dewey Decimal System, you may have heard of him. Actually, you may have not, because now I guess it's different than you're doing so much on the internet. I don't know how much you're relying on a library. It's those decimal systems when you go to a library where you look up a book and it'll give you a number and you have to go find out. That was a revolutionary at the time, guys. So John Dewey comes over. He decides that we need to make education compulsory, which means we have to make it where you don't have a choice. Parents have to send their kids to public school or private school. And if you don't, like, parents, you can get arrested. Like, it is crazy. So this is John Dewey is bringing this in. He thinks the Prussian model is great. And, this model is actually what demonized homeschool. In many states, it wasn't until recently where homeschool was even allowed to happen, because the state wanted control of education. So it's all comes from this Prussian model. And so when we say the school system has failed, the school system hasn't really failed. Kids aren't being educated, they're being, schooled. But that's what it was set up to do, because John Dewey and the Prussian model, they saw that too much individuality, too much thinking for yourself, well, that might cause social disorder, because you might disagree with something a politician or someone says, an authority figure says, and you very often might, and that's okay, and that's good, and that is what individuals are supposed to do. And so this whole system, John Taylor Gatto finds out, is just built to actually be this way, which is almost worse than it being on accident. So then I wanted to read you something else he said that I really, really love. And that is, so, I talked about how if you don't learn math the way somebody else does, maybe you'd be put in like a slower class, or you'd be made to feel like you weren't smart enough. And so John Taylor Gatto talks about this concept of genius. Like, what is a genius? And he says, I love this. Genius is as common as dirt. We suppress genius because we haven't yet figured out how to manage a population of educated men and women. The solution, I think, is simple and glorious. Let them manage themselves. That sums everything up right there in one sentence, lays it out like mic drop, as they say. Let them manage themselves. And so this concept of genius, you have somebody who gets really good grades in school, like best at math, and they're seen as this genius. Well, the kid who's drawing these amazing illustrations and wants to be a comic book artist is seen as slow because they're not as good as the rest of the classes at math, when it's like, no, there's different kinds of genius, but the school system has made it seem like it has to be one simple thing. But oh my goodness, There are musical geniuses. There are writing geniuses. There are baking geniuses, which is a skill. As somebody who bakes a lot of bread, that is a lot of science and chemistry goes into baking bread. But things like this, where there are so many different kinds of genius, but we're forcing kids that they have to fit into our set little tiny, they're pegs trying to fit into a square hole kind of thing, where it's like, it doesn't work that way. That's not the way the world works. And instead, we should let people manage themselves. We should let them be in control of their own education, this self-directed learning, that concept that kids, when they're left to pursue their passions, will want to learn. And there's a lot of people that think, they hear the term unschool or self-directed learning and they think, well, what kid is going to want to do anything but watch cartoons all day? They're going to sit in front of the couch. And I guarantee you, there's always outliers. Maybe there will be one or two of you that do that, but you each have passions, things that make you happy, things that really make you feel like alive, like you're doing what you were put on this earth to do. Maybe that's playing the piano or drawing or writing. And when left to have the decision of what you want to do, I think you will do that. And I trust that as individuals, you will pursue that passion if you're allowed to. And I wanted to read again, let them manage themselves. I mean, that just, So for followers, for lovers of John Taylor Gatto, he was so important to us because he taught us what education is. Schooling is trying to fit us into this model of this be obedient little foot soldiers, and keep your heads down model. But education is fostering a child, a student's ability to follow their bliss. Like I said before, that's one of my favorite lines at Joseph Campbell, who, great guy. He talks about myth. I've talked about him before. We'll do another episode about him, but he talks about that and pursuing your passion, finding your passion. So John Taylor Gatto really launched a education revolution. And, from that, we have, again, this unschool, revolution, this free range parenting, these new waves of learning that we're finally realizing that, hey, just because you're kids doesn't mean you're not an individual with individual wants and needs. And you have your own set of things you really love and want to do. So, John Taylor Gatto, I cannot recommend him enough. In fact, I'm going to show you some great books of his. I love the title of this, Weapons of Mass Instruction. This is a great one. Then he has Dumbing Us Down. That's another great one. And this one is like a behemoth. This one, and you'll notice I have like bookmarks and notes all over it because I was trying to pay as close of attention as I could. The Underground History of American Education. This one is so good. It is like a little bit more of a lengthy read, but it is so good. There's a lot of great stuff in there. He talks about people like Benjamin Franklin who didn't have formal schooling, but were still so educated and had all these, great skills that they learned outside of the classroom. So I could talk about this for hours. We will leave it there. But as you're going back to school, and whether that's homeschool or public school or private school, be thinking as a family, what is schooling and what is education? And if, you're one of the many, many people who do go to public school, which I did, a lot of people do, what are ways you can foster education at home after school? How can we really spark that joy of learning? So I will leave it there. Please, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast and share with friends. And until next time, I will talk to you later.